Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Glasgow and to Scotland's International Inclusive Growth Conference. For those that don't know me, my name's Gerry Gillespie. I'm the Chief Economic Advisor to the Scottish Government, and my role in this first session is mostly as facilitator. For those not familiar with Scotland, I can say as a native of Glasgow, you've arrived in the best city. Glasgow not only has the best football teams and rugby, but is also the friendliest people. So a heartfelt welcome to you all from a native Glaswegian. Today we have a great programme of speakers and workshops to ensure your participation. So it's really important to get you involved. For those that tweet, we have a hashtag inclusive growth. So please feel free to share your views on the conference. Now, just before we start, inclusive growth forms the heart of Scotland's economic strategy. We'll hear about progress today in Scotland and perspectives from international organisations, including the OECD and IMF. And we'll also hear from the experiences in different countries and also what's happening within Scotland and the UK. We're privileged to have such an array of international speakers and participants at this event, which to me reflects the importance of inclusive growth, both globally and the recognition for how Scotland is progressing this agenda. So my last task in this opening session is just to introduce our first speaker, Sir Anton Muscatelli, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Glasgow University. Anton's a distinguished economist in his own right. He's been an advisor to numerous governments, including the Scottish Government and the UK Government. He currently is a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisers and also chairs the First Minister's Standing Council of Europe. Please welcome Sir Anton.
Thank you, Gerry, for your very kind introduction and for inviting me to contribute to this very timely and welcome event today. The University of Glasgow is privileged to be your host today, and so can I add my warmest welcome to everyone. We're really delighted to see you all here. Since our founding in the 15th century, we've been at the forefront of innovation and change in Scotland. And so I'd like to argue that there is no better venue for a conference such as this. Indeed, I'd like to think that it might just be the catalyst which we need to bring about a minor revolution in how we carry out economic policy. We're lucky enough today to be hearing from a wide range of expert speakers on this important area, and we're particularly pleased to be joined this morning by the First Minister, whose leadership on the subject of inclusive growth has been vital to bringing us to this point. I'm also pleased to welcome all the international guests to the University, and on this topic, as much as any other, it's absolutely vital that we learn from the approaches taken around the world. Economic progress has always been geographically unbalanced, and Scotland is no exception to that. It remains a country of particular economic contrasts and social divides, shaped both by the failings of the past and the varying progress of places today. For those of you that don't know Scotland, the stark differences in life outcomes for men between two districts in Glasgow, Bearsden and Drumchapel, separated by only a few hundred yards, are replicated between the west and the east ends of Glasgow. There is by now the almost totemic example of the Argyll railway line. It's a railway line that runs west to east, and where every stop travelled from Jordan Hill in the west to Bridgeton in the east marks a 1.7-year drop in life expectancy for men and 1.2 years for women. And the Commission for Urban Economic Growth, linked to the Glasgow City deal, which I chair, is wrestling with this very issue at the moment. There are, of course, no easy answers. But what is clear, if we are to tackle it effectively, we will require input, advice and the hard work of the best minds across all sectors. There is, of course, a clear moral imperative to address such inequalities, and they've been a central concern for Scottish policymakers for many decades. It's now widely accepted that an emphasis on growth in GDP or GVA per capita offers too limited a view on development outcomes. The Scottish Government, supported by the adoption of a broader set of indicators of progress, has rightly adopted the logic that growth and progress have to benefit all. And this also aligns, of course, with the OECD's inclusive growth framework, which includes a measure of multidimensional, living standards designed to track societal welfare. And fairer outcomes are not just good for those at the bottom who will benefit from them directly. They will benefit us all in the long run, boosting productivity and helping to solve some of the social problems which have blighted our society for too long. To put it simply, as President Kennedy did in his inauguration speech, and I quote, "If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich." The Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission argued for a broad view of development and provided an intellectual backbone for policy interests in inclusive growth. Developing tractable and measurable alternatives to GDP and GVA remains important. But it's not just about moving to different multidimensional measures of prosperity. The more difficult task is how to provide tools for better policy making. How can we operationalize the concept of inclusive growth and develop the cross-sectoral policy measures that deliver real change? I strongly welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to inclusive growth. The challenge for all of us, however, is to put this commitment into practice and to ensure it permeates all policies and at all levels. And let me at this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, reveal a particular prejudice that I have as an economist. I strongly believe, at least in more advanced OECD economies like this one, that a key area of focus has to be on human capital formation. I do believe that skills bias technical change is a really important causal factor which has driven greater inequality in countries like the US and indeed the UK. And to counter these effects in terms of human capital formation, we have to look at a number of key areas, and these include, first of all, equality of access to quality early years and basic education. Second, gender parity in our market economies. Third, active labour market policies to encourage movement into work and targeted non-standard work benefits and protections. And fourth, increased higher-level skills formation at tertiary level to match that human capital formation to that rapid technological change, which is only going to accelerate over the next few decades. And indeed, one particular area which I've been particularly heartened to see a renewed focus on inclusive growth has been around recent discussions on city deals here in Scotland. These have seen the potential for a welcome refocusing on how such deals can be used to meet our wider social and economic challenges rather than a simple package of infrastructure projects. And the particular areas of focus and associated projects of the city deals in Glasgow and elsewhere will be matters, of course, for politicians, but I do think there's a real opportunity to use what are clearly innovative and exciting models of investment in innovation and skills as a launchpad for the inclusive growth agenda. They are therefore well placed to, I think, address the wider social issues, and I really look forward to an ongoing discussion on this point. I know it's one of the topics for today's agenda. Let me also address the vexed issue of taxation, which often raises its head in discussions about inclusive growth. Redistributive policies can, of course, help achieve greater equality of outcomes, and larger fiscal transfers can be compatible with long-term growth and competitiveness. But redistributive policies on their own are not always the most effective option for improving socio-economic inclusion. Some countries achieve lower levels of pre-transfer inequality because they have better human capital formation policies, and they have managed to tackle rent-seeking behaviour by some sectors of society, like business, through areas like fair work, for instance, which is hugely important. So what most economists would advise is to avert your gaze from any correlations or spurious correlations between tax levels and growth. Intelligent government should not only focus on increasing taxation and transfers as pure redistribution. Instead, it's about what are you going to do with that higher taxation and fiscal transfer, how the optimal design of supply-side policies would allow those additional revenues to generate growth policies for the whole of society. And that approach to better government will also generate greater social consensus around higher taxation and fiscal transfers. So for sure, strategic imperatives provide a point of departure, but rethinking policy and investment choices and reframing spending approaches requires us to be clear-sighted about two key things. First, which aspects of inclusive growth are most critical? And secondly, what ability, what capacity do we have to change outcomes? So I hope today provides space to consider how we can make real progress on inclusive growth and on working towards solutions for some of those serious social and economic problems facing not only Scotland and the UK, but indeed most economies around the world. And that's a very real challenge. So can I indulge myself and just quote President Kennedy one more time? And it's the following quote, when he said, "A challenge we're willing to accept, one we're unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win." I believe getting inclusive growth right is indeed really important for Scotland's economic and social future, but it's important for the whole of our global society. And I look forward to engaging with you throughout the day to see how we can best make it happen. Thank you. It's now my very great pleasure to welcome and introduce our next keynote speaker, one who needs very little introduction, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. It probably says all that needs to be said about the government's commitment to the theme of the conference today, that the First Minister should be here to launch this day in our discussion. So, thanking you for your time and willingness to address the conference, can I now invite you, First Minister, to deliver your keynote address?
Thank you very much, Gary, for getting us underway today, and thank you, Anton, for words that I think perfectly set the scene for today. It's always a great pleasure for me to be here at the University of Glasgow. I spent 5 very happy years here as a student. It feels like yesterday, but I can tell you it's a lot further back in the past than that. Of course, back in those days, I would never have seen the inside of a lecture theatre this early on a Friday morning. So this is at least one marked difference from my student days. It's a particular pleasure, though, to welcome all of you here today. This is, I think I can safely say, an extremely distinguished international gathering. I know we have guests here today from Australia, New Zealand, Costa Rica, as well as representatives from several of our European neighbours and indeed from across the UK. So I welcome all of you very warmly to the great city of Glasgow. As First Minister, even though I've spent much of my life here in Glasgow, but as First Minister I probably shouldn't show favouritism when it comes to adjudicating the merits of various Scottish cities, so I will settle with a welcome to the wonderful, fantastic city of Glasgow. I hope you have a wonderful time here. Enjoy all of the hospitality that Glasgow and Scotland has to offer, although some of Scotland's most famous hospitality, I should say, should probably be enjoyed in moderation. But please enjoy it. I hope you have a wonderful time here. The Scottish Government really values the chance to engage with international experts, and indeed that's one of the reasons why I'm so delighted that, as well as this conference today, as part of this conference, also sees the first meeting of the Wellbeing Alliance, which is a partnership between different regions, different countries, that is seeking to develop a sustainable economic model focused on well-being. Really important work, and I'm very proud that Scotland is playing a leading role in it. Today's conference is important. I think we all understand the importance of it, but there are 2 reasons why today's conference is also very timely. You know, we live in a world today where it can appear that the forces of isolation and protectionism are on the rise. So against that backdrop, it's all the more important that different countries and like-minded people come together to learn from each other and to both imagine and work out how we advance a better world, if I can be as idealistic as that. In my view, these days politicians are perhaps not as idealistic as we should be. But the second reason this is timely is that we now have a situation where the topic of inclusive growth is talked about in a much more mainstream way than has ever been the case before. I remember around 3 years ago when the Scottish Government started talking about inclusive growth, it felt like quite a niche subject. That's different today. International organisations like the IMF, the OECD, countries across the globe have placed inclusive growth much higher up the agenda. So we've made significant progress in changing or starting to change the narrative about what we should be seeking to achieve through economic policy. But we still have a way to go in determining the actions we must take to give substance to that agenda. And that is the second reason why I think today's conference is really timely, because it allows us to come together to look not just at the theory of inclusive growth, but how we advance the practice of inclusive growth. So for both those reasons, this couldn't really be a better time to have everybody gathered here to discuss what is an extremely important issue. We've, right now in the UK and in Scotland, we don't have to look very far for very hard, tangible, practical reminders of why this agenda matters. Just last week, the Office for Budget Responsibility here in the UK set out just how deep-seated and damaging the UK's productivity crisis has been during the decade since the financial crisis. And that matters, of course, because low productivity is closely linked to the stagnation in real wages that is being experienced across the UK. And that, combined with inequality, and of course that inequality is exacerbated by that stagnation in real wages, and also an attack and an undermining of the welfare social safety net that we have seen. All of that has contributed and will continue to contribute, if we don't address it, to some of the political shocks that we have seen, not just in this country, but across the world. Here in the UK, there is no doubt that that sense of legitimate dissatisfaction around living standards, inequality and the economic status quo was one of perhaps the biggest factor in the outcome of the EU referendum. It's also undoubtedly one of the factors in some of the other political developments we've seen across the world, perhaps most notably in the United States. So the issues we're talking about today really matter. And that's why it is so important to have all of you here to turn our minds and our attention to how we better address these factors. Before I perhaps talk a little bit about what Scotland is seeking to do to try to address these issues, it's probably a good idea to give some context to Scotland's position at the moment. On some measures, Scotland is doing and has over the last decade done relatively well. I want to stress, though, and ask you to keep in mind that word relatively. This is not what I'm about to say here, some complacent assessment of our progress. So that word relatively matters. But on some measures, we have done relatively well. For example, over that 10-year period, we have virtually closed what was a long-standing productivity gap with the rest of the UK. We also have lower income inequality levels than the UK as a whole, but our income inequality levels are far too wide. The value of our international exports has also increased over the past few years by 2/5, and we have today unemployment levels in Scotland that are at a near record low. So these are all measures where we are doing relatively well, and we shouldn't dismiss that. They reflect many of the economic strengths we have as a country. We have more world-class universities per head of population than any other country in the world, bar Luxembourg, and we've got Luxembourg well in our sights, I have to say. That is part of the reason why we have what has been described as the most highly qualified population anywhere in Europe. We are clearly an attractive place to live, to work, to do business. We are the most successful part of the UK outside of London when it comes to attracting international investment. And we have a well-deserved international reputation in a range of economic sectors that are important now and will continue to be important in the future. Sectors like life sciences, creative industries, food and drink, tourism, energy, not just oil and gas, but renewable energy as well. And energy is a good and timely example. Earlier this week, I had the privilege of opening the world's first floating wind farm, 25 miles offshore in the northeast of Scotland. Now that's an incredible example of the scale of Scotland's renewable energy potential, but also of the technological ingenuity which is now helping to harness those resources. One of the big challenges for us as a country in the future is how we make sure that more of the economic benefit of these technological innovations are realised here in Scotland. So on the face of it, Scotland is a nation of great wealth and great potential. But like most advanced economies, we also face long-term structural challenges. Although, for example, we have, as I said a moment ago, closed the productivity gap with the rest of the UK, we still lag significantly behind countries such as Sweden, Germany and the United States. We, like countries across the globe, need to adapt to an ageing population. We must make progress towards the low-carbon age, and we must ensure skilled and well-paid job opportunities in an age of increasing automation. And of course, deep inequalities exist in our society, which are reflected in reduced educational outcomes, poorer health and lower life expectancies. These are big challenges for any country. Of course, in Scotland and across the UK, they are made all the more acute right now and perhaps more difficult to address by the shadow of Brexit that looms over everything we do. There is no doubt that Brexit, particularly if we end up outside the European single market, will make it harder to address many of the challenges we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't and mustn't do everything we can to address those. It simply heightens the responsibility that is on our shoulders. So we must use the potential we've got to become a more productive economy, but also to become a fairer and more equal society. And one of the things we've sought to do since we have tried to prioritise inclusive growth, which many other countries are now doing as well, is increasingly recognise and have recognised in part of the public debate this fact that the twin challenges of greater competitiveness and greater equality are not competing. They are two sides of the same coin. We will have an even more productive and competitive economy if we have a fairer society. And it's where I think in Scotland we have made significant progress in shifting the terms of that debate, but there's more work to do. And of course, that point, that argument, is now borne out by a really significant body of analysis. OECD, for example, estimated that between 1990 and 2010, rising income inequality in the UK reduced economic output per head by 9 percentage points. Now, to put that in context, that's approximately £1,600 for everybody in the country. So there is hard evidence that rising inequality harms economic growth and harms living standards of people right across the country. Later today, you will hear from Gerry Rice of the IMF, and the IMF just last week published a report which set out how, for example, measures like more progressive taxation could help us to tackle inequality. And the report made clear that inequality can erode social cohesion, lead to political polarisation, and ultimately lower economic growth. And I think that's really important, that we now have the evidence to back up what many of us have believed instinctively for a long time, that the greater the inequalities in your society, the less your ability will be to reach your full potential. It stands to reason, when you take even a few seconds to think about it, societies are more likely to succeed if every individual within a society has a fair chance to flourish. So that's what we've always believed instinctively, but it can't be overestimated how important it is now to have the evidence to back that up. So this is the view that the Scottish Government has not just been talking about, but has sought to put right at the heart of our economic approach. When we revised our economic strategy back in 2015, we based it upon 4 interdependent themes. For reasons that will become immediately obvious to you, we described this as the 4 I's of our economic strategy. Innovation, internationalisation and investment were 3 of them, but the 4th was inclusive growth. So we put inclusive growth right up there with other objectives at the heart of our economic strategy. And what does that mean in practice? Well, it means a number of things in practice. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but just as examples, it means a shift in how we see policies that traditionally are seen as social policies, expanding childcare, for example, which we have ambitious plans to do, raising attainment in our schools. These are important social policies, but they are policies that have a very significant economic impact as well. It has meant intensifying our efforts to tackle poverty. We, in Scotland, deliberately choose to mitigate some of the worst aspects of the welfare reforms that we've seen across the UK, because those have the effect of driving more people into poverty. But more fundamentally, albeit with still relatively limited powers here in Scotland, we are legislating for targets to reduce and ultimately eradicate child poverty. But legislating for the targets is the easy bit. We are backing that with a range of policies to deliver on those targets. It has also meant a more fundamental understanding of place. So the investments we're making in transport and digital infrastructure are designed to improve connectivity across the country, particularly for rural, coastal and island communities. 1 in 5 of the Scottish population lives in what would be described as a rural community, so that is really important. We've established the Scottish Cities Alliance, a partnership between the Scottish Government and the leaders of our 7 cities, and that's increasingly working closely with the OECD on things like the New York proposal for inclusive growth in cities and the Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth initiative. We're also taking steps to promote greater gender equality. Talking to Gerry earlier on, he made the comment that when Christine Lagarde was asked last week what was the single most important thing that could be done to reduce inequality, she said, invest in women, which I agree with wholeheartedly, I have to say. But promoting greater gender equality in the workplace and across society is not only the right thing to do, it matters hugely to our economy. Gabriella pointed out earlier this year that if as many women as men were in work, the total output of OECD countries would be 12% higher over the next 20 years. So that is hugely and fundamentally important to what we're talking about. And more broadly, we have developed in Scotland, which I would say, while we've made great progress, is still at its early stage. We've developed an approach that we are calling fair work. And when I say that's still at an early stage, it's not to underplay the progress we've made. It's simply to remind ourselves that we still have work to do to make sure that it's more than just a tick box exercise about specific fair work practices, important though they are. It's about embedding a different approach to the workplace through everything we do. And as part of that, we're encouraging employers to boost productivity and invest in their own workforces, not just as the right thing to do, but as part of an approach that will see them become more profitable and successful. We've put particular focus on things like the living wage, for example. When I became First Minister 3 years ago, we had 50 companies in Scotland who were accredited living wage employers. There are now more than 900, and a higher proportion of employees in Scotland are paid the real living wage than any other part of the UK. We also developed the Scottish Business Pledge, which celebrates companies that voluntarily agree to progressive business practices, and I'm delighted that Dougal Bailey, a consultancy and engineering firm who are here at today's event, has just become the 400th company in Scotland to sign up to the Business Pledge. But the key point here that I'm making, the fundamental point, is that inclusive growth isn't and cannot be separate from other strands of the economic strategy. All of these strands are interdependent. And the Scottish Business Pledge in some ways epitomises that point by celebrating and encouraging internationalisation and innovation as progressive business practices, alongside employing young people, promoting gender equality and paying the living wage. Our vision overall for Scotland, and our programme for government for this year is very clear on this, is as a country whose economy is based on innovation and internationalisation. And of course, those two things are very closely linked. We live in a world that is changing at a more rapid pace than has been the case in my lifetime. Our challenge in Scotland, our ambition in Scotland, is to be the country that develops and manufactures and exports the innovations of the future, not just a country that consumes and deploys those innovations. So we need all businesses across all sectors to have that ambition to be innovative and to see themselves as innovators in their own fields. We've announced some significant measures in recent months to promote innovation, and in doing so to help advance the inclusive growth agenda, increase funding for business research and development, additional support for manufacturing in key sectors of the economy, increased investment in skills and in our enterprise agencies. We've also set out what I think is a really important intention to create a Scottish National Investment Bank. The Council of Economic Advisers that advises me and the government, some of them here today, in fact the chair of it here today, identified that such an institution could help us deliver more support for infrastructure development, more finance for high growth businesses and strategic investments in innovation. And today we're launching a consultation on the detail of how an investment bank can deliver these aims. However, we recognise, coming back to the point of today, that inclusive growth is an essential part, not an add-on, not a luxury, an essential part of that focus on innovation and productivity. So we've also announced a range of measures to ensure that as we transform our economy, we're doing everything possible to ensure that no one in society is being left behind. So, for example, we will establish a Just Transition Commission, which will be a panel of experts from across society to advise us on making the move to a low-carbon economy as equitable as possible. We're also looking at ways in which we can support the growth of employee ownership, a key part of our Fair Work agenda. And despite the fact that this has some critics, we are also going to work with interested local authorities to fund research into the feasibility of a citizens' basic income scheme. Now, I should stress our work on this is at a very early stage. It might turn out not to be the answer. It might turn out not to be feasible. But as work and employment changes as rapidly as it is doing, I think it's really important that we look and are prepared to be open-minded about different ways in which we can support individuals to participate fully in the new economy. And of course, all of this will continue to sit alongside our action to tackle poverty, raise attainment in schools, to promote gender equality, to give life to that belief that our economy is going to be more successful if we have a society that allows every individual to participate to their full potential. That then is our commitment to building a truly inclusive economy. When you came up here today, you will undoubtedly, some of us had our photograph taken beside it, you will have passed the statue of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, of course, was a student and later a professor here at Glasgow University. Smith is, and this is a source of frustration, I think, to many of us in Scotland, Smith is one of the most misinterpreted and misquoted economists in human history. He's often held up as this believer in untrammelled free markets. But actually, when you read Adam Smith, you quickly understand that he would have been an enthusiastic proponent of what we are talking about here today. He said, in The Wealth of Nations, what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconvenience to the whole. No society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So Smith recognised that the major choices we make in economic policy aren't about what sort of economy we want to create, they are about what kind of society we want to live in. And that, I hope, is something reflected in our wider approach to government. GDP is an important indicator of economic performance, but it is not the only one and shouldn't be the only one. That's why we link our performance to a wider range of indicators and why we are enthusiastic and we're one of the first countries to adopt the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we're doing here in Scotland. But if I can finish on this final point, which brings us back to why we're here today. We're proud of some of the work we're doing in Scotland, but we don't have all the answers. And there are more things that we can and should be doing. So we want to hear from you. We want to share with you what we're doing and hope that you will take that experience back to your own countries. But we want to hear from you so we can learn from you as well. So please enjoy today's session. We certainly look forward to hearing your contributions. And together, I think we are at a really opportune moment in history where we can perhaps change the paradigm of economics, put inclusive growth not just at the top of the agenda in theory, but at the top of the agenda in practice as well, and in so doing, change for the better the lives and the life chances of the people we're here to represent and serve. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, First Minister. That was a very comprehensive address and set the context for inclusive growth in Scotland. I'm now going to call on our next speaker, actually the first of our international speakers, Gabriella Ramos, to take to the panel. For those that don't know Gabriella, amongst her duties at the OECD, she's Special Counsellor to the Secretary-General. She's the Chief of Staff and Sherpa to the G20. She also leads the OECD work on inclusive growth and new approaches to economic challenges. And earlier this year, she was awarded the Forbes Prize in recognition of her work on inclusive growth and gender equality. And her resume goes back before the OECD. Prior to joining there, she was also a minister in the Mexican government, covering a range of activities, including the economy. So, Gabriella, thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for hosting us, Professor, First Minister. Great to hear you, and great to be here accompanied by the IMF and by the other speakers, Minister, and Alenka. Great to have you here. I have to say that after listening to the First Minister, I will just go back to my seat because I endorse what you said. I think that this is the shift that we need to put together in our discussions, because the reality is that we always have this mindset by which we build up this level of inequalities, to think that growth will solve it all, to think that the tide will lift all the boats, and to think that you just need to grow and care about redistribution later, or to take it forward to growth and then you care about the environment later. But it's always this two-step approach that I think that has harmed so much the outcomes. And also the other element that is so important is the metrics that we use. Not only the growth model, which was just looking at the efficiency of markets and just go to increase the GDP and GDP per capita, but also the fact that we did not look at the multidimensional characteristics of well-being of people. And we just go unnoticed the question of distribution of outcomes. And it's not only about the material well-being, as was mentioned, it's also the question of all the elements that people have to go and have a productive life and to have the means to contribute to the productive economy. So I think this is a very welcome reminder, and this is something that we at the OECD has been looking forward. And we have produced a lot of evidence. And of course, we're joined by the IMF. We do not only produce the evidence, we try to bring it to the table of leaders. And we also, I'm the Sherpa to the G20, from the OECD to the G20. We have to put it in the G20. I think we managed to put at least the titles, not only of inclusive growth, but also of gender equality. We did it by showing how much countries lose out of not using the potential of women, how much we lose at losing the potential of the bottom 40%. The OECD also gathers the most advanced economies of the world, those that have very developed social safety nets, is the bottom 40% of our societies. And I cannot say that this is inequality, it's just complete upside down of our economies. The OECD started documenting these trends in 1999. We started to look at the distribution of income. And in 2009, after a decade of working on it, we produced a report that was called Growing Unequal with a question mark. By three years later, we took out the question mark because it was clear. We produced another report that was divided with stand. And just 2 days ago, we produced another report that says aging unequal, which tells us the whole narrative is to say some people get it very bad. They accumulate disadvantages, they receive bad education, they receive bad health, they don't have good quality jobs, they cannot contribute to a pension, and therefore poor kids become old age poor people. So this is, I think, what we need to have in mind and do not allow it to continue as such. And it's time to act. As you mentioned, First Minister, we have a lot of evidence. Lots of evidence. We have been producing this evidence, and I will share with you some of these arguments that we have developed to talk actually to the finance ministers. Very important, because this is not a social agenda only. It's an agenda of an economic model that we need to change, a growth model that we need to change, because it failed us with the crisis, it failed us with inequality, and it failed us with the environment. So how far we want to take it. And it fails us also producing very fragmented societies. And we have seen it, the backlash on globalization, the increase on populism, the increase on terrorism, all these forces that are telling us that it's just not working. So, as I said, while focusing on GDP per capita, we did not analyze the skewed distribution of the benefits of growth. And let me just take you to some of the features. Inequality has really stayed stubbornly high, but inequality is also in the wrong trend because it's growing. And at the OECD, we have calculated that the average disposable income of the richest 10% of the population is now around 10 times that of the poorest 10% across the OECD, up from 25 years ago. And what is remarkable is not only the question of income distribution, it's also that the fact that the growth dynamics benefited the top. The top 1% of the income distribution captured 47% of total growth in pre-tax income in the US. That means that if you take the benefits to the top 1%, it's as if the US economy has grown 50% less during the last 2 decades. And so it's just staggering. 37% in Canada and 20% in the UK. Inequality actually worsened during the crisis. This is another, you can see it here, because what happens is that as soon as the crisis started to recede, the majority of income gains went to the rich and redistribution weakened or stagnated in OECD countries. The picture is even more troublesome in terms of wealth. Take a look at this graph. It's just amazing. What it's telling you is that the richest 10% of the OECD is owning around half of all household assets. But if you go into the 10% and you look at the 5%, which are the little triangles, then you see that the 5% also cover like 30%. And if you go to the top 1%, they keep 19% of wealth, while the bottom 40% keeps only 3%. You can see it there. The little circles in white are the bottom of the income and how much they have wealth or not, and I can say that they don't. The other part of the story of the First Minister mentioned is the question of gender. How could it be that in our countries, where rule of law prevails, I was actually in MENA, and I deliver a report on gender, and I was looking at the issues, and actually all the discriminatory features are in the law. In our countries, it's not in the law, but we have 20%, 17% difference in wage cap. How does that happen? And of course, the participation of women or the level of education of women, the women in STEM, all these things matter. So we need to take a hard look at that another angle, because again, we are wasting the talent that we can use for our economies. Another very important aspect, regional divides. You would not be surprised. In the UK, I think that one of the most striking features is the divergence in performance in different regions, and you can even track the position regarding Brexit on these regional divides. So this is also very important. How would you explain the difference between Washington and Mackay? When you have the very same frameworks, fiscal frameworks and federal arrangements is another area to be concerned about. Another topic, well-being. This is a very important topic because it's true that some regions fare well in certain areas, and we have 11 dimensions of well-being. You can see here Scotland performing very high on some well-being dimensions, such as community, but could improve in some others, like health. But this gives you, as the First Minister said, but as we have tried in the OECD, to have more granular analysis. Let's get away from the averages, and let's get away from general characterizations of how we're faring. What are the drivers of this inequality? First, no doubt, globalization and technological change. That's a fact. Take a look at the big data, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. What happens with this digital revolution? That they are codifying certain cognitive skills that humans should be doing or were doing. And take a look at this impressive graph. What has been push aside are those middle-level skills that can be codified. So what we are having with the technological change, when you say skill-biased technological change, is because you are producing very low skills, very low jobs for low skills, or very high-level skills. But the middle ground, all the gray area at the bottom, are being lost away. So that's an area that we need to really think about it and see how we can turn this technological revolution. And we know that it's promising. We know that it has a lot of promise. But this has also brought to the job polarization across more OECD countries and the erosion of mid-level skills. And this is related also to what has been mentioned in terms of the education and capacity. The other element, the productivity issue. But we all say, oh my God, productivity is stagnant. It's not. What happened is that we have the frontier firms that continue to grow at 3 to 5% productivity growth in all of the OECD countries, and the rest of the firms. And what happens is that as we said, that the top of the income are really getting all the advantages and the bottom are just accumulating these advantages, you have lots of firms that have not the same access to finance, that cannot use the patent systems the way they can. They cannot arbitrage tax systems, and so that cannot attract the talent that high-level firms are attracting, and particularly in the knowledge-based society. And what happens is that this productivity divergence that has increased, according to our evidence, is also bringing the wage dispersion that you also talk about, because the low-skilled firms, of course, cannot go into paying high-level wages. So we really need to level the playing field for all the firms. So the tax issue, I think this is a very important element. Rapidly growing capital mobility worldwide has been accompanied by the increased use of tax havens. This is an area that the OECD has also been championing in the context of the G20 with our tax erosion and tax evasion initiatives. Estimates of the size of the offshore assets range from $6 trillion to $7.6 trillion. And this is another aspect that really hurts the minds of our societies, because there are some people that are really using tax competition not to pay their share, their due share of taxes or their fair share of taxes. And this has also eroded the progressivity of our tax systems and thus contributing to the rising inequalities. Another element of this increase in inequality is the financialization of our economy. We know, redistribution has also tended to decline in OECD countries. We have tightened the benefits from those social transfers, and we have also increased the requirements for people to access those. And therefore, the tax and transfer system in our societies, that are usually those that are advanced in this area, let's not even talk about, I'm Mexican, so we don't even have the social safety nets. We still need to build it, but those that have the safety nets have become less effective. And the other area that I wanted to bring you in terms of the sources of these disparities, I will say here, is the financialization of our economies. You all know that the size of the financial markets have grown 3-4 times higher than the GDP growth. And this, of course, led to the unsustainability of the system and to the breakdown. But thinking about how the financialization of our economies had impact negatively on the inequality issue has several mechanisms. First, finance workers are concentrated at the very top of the income distribution and earn premiums unlinked to their productivity compared with their peers in other sectors. And this also fuels this discontent when people see how are these bonuses going everywhere to the finance workers. High earners can and do borrow more than the majority of credit goes to these high earners. And third, most of the benefits of the stock market expansion goes to affluent households. So these are some of the elements. I mentioned already the question of the fiscal the redistribution and the cuts in the sides. So what we say at the OECD is it's time to act. I think enough of evidence. We will continue, of course, because that's our nature. We love to run regressions and come with these outcomes. But I think that we really would tell policymakers, will tell business sector, will tell society as a whole, I think it's time to act. Because inequalities really plays a hard toll to our societies. And as we said, this narrative change in terms of how you bring together the competitiveness of the economy and more equal societies is a very important element. Alenka was with us in the OECD in the ministerial, and we tried to advance this notion of inclusive productivity, First Minister, and we didn't get to first round. People said, this is an oxymoron. I mean, one thing is the efficiency of markets that goes to the productivity, competition, and the other thing is social policies in the framing that the old framing we have. But I think that we more and more are really moving into this notion that we're losing a lot. Our societies are losing a lot of competitiveness. What the First Minister mentioned of our work in terms of how much growth has been lost out of inequality, 6 to 10 percentage point. My own country is just very, very unequal. So I think this is very important. But it's also important to note that rising inequalities put further pressure on public social budgets, which are already overwhelmed due to population aging and rising healthcare and pension cost. And the other part is that the other angle is that it also brings a lack of social mobility. And this is another element of our analysis. If you are born in certain families, for example, first you have lower performance. We are the House of PISA report, and you can see there, depending on your social background, you will have higher levels of school performance and attainment or lower, but also you will have less year of schooling. If you are born in a family that doesn't have secondary education, you have only 15% chances of acceding to that level. Whether if you are in a house that has it, is 65%. On top of all the networks and all the elements that, of course, comes with wealthy families. So this is another element that we need to really take a look at. The other area is health. We know that low education then brings lower levels of health, and then even lower years of life expectancy. People from the bottom of the income distribution might have even 8 years less of life expectancy, which is just staggering. I think that is just a call, a cry to say, let's just do something. So finally, what does all this bring us to? And this is also something that this is the outcomes of one generation framing the potential of the next. It's just blanket, it's just so clear there. The impact inequalities in life chances, as I said, how much your situation erodes the possibility to have a wealthy, and all these elements bring us to the most important element, which is the lack of trust. Governing is becoming very difficult because people don't have trust. And when we say fake news, it's not fake news, it's just that they don't believe the experts. And we are the experts. So it's our problem, it's not their problem. I think that it is for us to regain that confidence that is not there anymore. So what is there to be done? I think, first of all, change the metrics. Change the metrics. Let's just move away from average outcomes. Let's just move away from aggregate outcomes. Let's endorse a well-being agenda. Let's have metrics that really tell us not only about the outcomes, but also the distributional impact. And that's why we produce a multidimensional living standard. We produce the nexus, this competitiveness, inclusiveness areas, and try to pursue integrated policy packages and to think that it's not only about social transfer, it's about giving the chance to every single person to succeed in their lives, to develop their full potential. And the bottom 40%, this is staggering because we said the bottom 40 as if it was the bottom 2%. It's not the bottom 40. In my country, it's the bottom 60%. There's no longer the bottom. It's a majority. So let's just think about 40%. Those are the groups that are not getting the means to succeed. The early, the better. I would say look at early child care and education. Quality child care and education is one of the most important instruments for equalizing the chances that people have. And it's not about cognitive skills only. It's about social-emotional skills. Because one of the things that children for poor families don't have is this environment, caring environment, that will give them self-confidence and the social-emotional skills that you actually need so much in the digital world. We need to overhaul their tax systems. We're happy to have brought the BEPS and the automatic exchange of information, but we really need to take a look at the progressivity of the tax systems, and we really need to take a look to overhauling the social transfer systems. And also think about the digital revolution, because now we used to have social systems that protected jobs, that tried to keep jobs. We cannot do that because jobs are just changing. Functions are changing. We create jobs that did not exist, and our children will be dedicated to jobs that don't exist today. So what we need to do is to protect workers, not the jobs, the workers, not the sectors, just the workers. And protecting the workers, of course, has to do with endowing them with the skills, with the aims, and with the tools to succeed. And think about the digital technologies. Think about broadband access. Think about digital skills. Think about, you have in Scotland the government's community broadband initiative. I think that's fantastic because at 65% coverage, I think it's very important that we continue doing that effort to look into these issues. Gender equality, very important, is not rocket science. It's just not rocket science. Dual parental leave is just encourage parents and give incentives to parents, reward parents, fathers, when they take a break in their careers to take care of children, and also to eliminate discrimination in the workplace and to try to fill this question of the gender gap that it doesn't have any sense in our modern societies. I have to say that this wage gap, but also representation. I was sitting at the G20 last time in Hamburg, and Prime Minister Trudeau said, let's just get real, because this table, how many women? I'm so glad to have you, First Minister. but you look around, and it's true. Go to the finance ministers, how many women? Go to the hardcore issue ministries, and you rarely find women at the top. So that's a very important element. I know that the Scottish Parliament has 35% women, and Westminster is only 32%. But let me tell you, in Mexico, they put a quota. People fear quota, but the reality is that we're saying all these people need affirmative action, because the reality is that the leveling the playing field is not so easy. And the president of Congress in Mexico told me, I hate quotas because we will be full of incompetent women. And I said, oh my God, we're full of incompetent men without a quota. So let's just be real. So we really need to invest in inclusive growth policies such as childhood, primary and tertiary education. Being in this wonderful house, we cannot forget tertiary education, and take a look at how you continue upskilling the labor force, because with the rapid technological games, I think that we need to be continuing in terms of how do we advance the skills of people. Think about how to level the playing fields to all firms, including new firms and SMEs. Think about the role that different levels of government should do. Today, Secretary General Gurria is in Seoul with the champion mayors, and think about the strategies that will bring about this change in the mindset. And I would like to just finish with something that Dennis Snauer from the Kiel Institute, because what I really like is that we see more and more committed people, institutions, governments to this idea, and I think that we really need to move to the action phase of this agenda. And Dennis Snauer said, you know what, in the digital economy and in the context where we really are rethinking the role of the state again, after our unfettered confidence in markets just crashed, and he said, in the 30s, when we had this huge crisis, the welfare state emerged. And we thought about the welfare state, the transfers, we cannot longer think about the welfare state because it's existentialist, it's trying to help those that are so weak. No, we need to think about the empowering state, a state that gives the means to people to succeed, and then to really take advantage of their own capacities to advance their own well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriella, for a really insightful tour of the whole arena of inequality, inclusive growth, bringing the wealth of experience from the OECD and evidence. And as someone who likes to use charts, I'll pinch some of your charts, so I'll tell you just now. We're going to move on quickly now for three kind of quick-fire contributions From our guests on the other side of the lectern, I'll introduce our speaker, Derek Mackay, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Constitution within the Scottish Government, and Derek will introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you. In terms of what Gabriella has said, politicians listening to experts is absolutely a good thing, and I was listening to every word with great interest, and I do feel a wee bit guilty that I'm a man, I have to say.
For the time being.
Well, I was about to say that I think I've made enough controversial announcements in my own life, First Minister. That one may well be in keeping with your views on diversity, but it might not be in keeping with where I headed to be. I do actually like the Finance Ministry job, I have to say. Per Bolund will also appreciate as a fellow Finance Minister. Some would say the second best job in government. I would say it's the best job in government, for the avoidance of doubt, First Minister. Not the only minister here as well, because actually we have gender balance in terms of ministerial representation, in terms of serving ministers, First Minister, and Alenka, of course, from Slovenia as well. So we actually have 4 ministers, 4 serving ministers, 2 male, 2 female. And we don't think we set out to do that, but that's the kind of spirit of equality that we have. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the next 2 speakers and just add to the context on fiscal matters and global aspiration around this agenda of inclusive growth. And Per Bolund is from Sweden, a deputy finance minister. Would you agree that it's the second best job in government?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. I'll convey that back to your government. From the Green Party, I understand you're going to the Green Party conference next. Put in a good word for me, if you can, as well. So I'll introduce you in just a moment. And Gerry Rice, of course, from the IMF. We're delighted that you're here with us also. The First Minister's given a very comprehensive statement and address on our position and our vision. I just want to add to that a wee bit in terms of some of the policies that we're deploying, what I've been able to do as Finance Secretary. Is we're very focused on inclusive growth now and into the future. And this conference is timely, not just because of international events, and I know for some politicians it's maybe not fashionable to listen to experts, but of course there's short-term decisions, or the imminent Scottish budget, for example, but a long-term vision around inclusive growth as well. Not new to the Scottish Government, but we have to look at international practice and the measures that we can deploy to deliver on the ground very ambitious aspirations that we are all equal, and we should have fairness within our system on spending as well as income and fiscal policy and taxation as well. And my first budget was focused on stability and stimulus as well, and of course sustainability, and that will certainly be the case going forward. A programme for government that the First Minister delivered, very much focused on those themes of inclusion and innovation, but also education and how it relates to the economy and the environment also, because the environment that we have inherited, it's our duty to make sure that we leave behind a good environment for future generations as well. But if I turn straight to tax policies, they must work in tandem with spending policies. Of course they should. And that's back to Gabriella's point as well about the integration of policies to get maximum delivery. And Gerry, I think, will say a bit more around the... Well, I hope you'll say a bit more, because it's been suggested to me that you might, on your annual fiscal monitor report, which showed how there is a very positive relationship between redistribution and tax and outcomes as well. So fiscal policy is incredibly important as we have growth, that we all enjoy that growth and ensure that it's shared right across our country. And yes, there's policy decisions that we can take, but we also have a leadership role as well, and the First Minister touched upon this. It's the culture that we create as well, not just through regulation, our own decisions, but the culture that's created and something of a need for this alliance of inclusive growth across the world also. So we will look at using our new powers. We have greater flexibility on income tax powers, and we'll shortly launch a discussion paper on income tax. And the First Minister's mentioned Adam Smith, and we've hopefully held true to his principles around taxation of certainty and convenience and effectiveness, efficiency and payment, but crucially progressivity as well in terms of taxation based on the ability to pay. Just at a more local level, we have reformed council tax so that higher value houses pay more in terms of the multiplier. We believe that that makes local taxation fairer, and we're looking at income tax, and part of the balance there is to ensure that, yes, there's sustainability of our public services. We face UK government budget cuts and the threat of Brexit as well, but of course we'll engage in that. And I've heard many businesses say that more than just low tax, they want certainty. Well, you bet that they want certainty, and I've never known so much political turbulence as there has been at this time, but certainty and clarity on what we are trying to achieve. On business rates, and I see that the FSB is represented as well, we've been able to lift around 100,000 properties, businesses out of taxation, targeted at the smallest businesses. And I think that has been an absolute lifeline to many, and that sense of entrepreneurship as well. Further reforms on business rates are to come. It's very much geared towards growth and ensuring that we share that opportunity with everyone, supporting particularly our town centres in many communities where it's made a difference. This is all part of a social contract, raising resources, of course, to spend it in a responsible and evidence-based way as well. And that's why we have the social contract in Scotland around free higher education, free personal care, free prescriptions and supporting other vital public services. And yes, there is divergence with UK government policy on many of these matters, and I'm sure on current trajectory more to come. We want to do more on childcare, and the First Minister has touched upon that as well, of course, in tackling the attainment gap that exists within education, not just in Scotland but across the globe. But we have set out very specific measures to tackle that as well. And our welfare state, as it's described, our social security system, ensuring that it's fairness and dignity and respect that's part of this new system that we will have in Scotland, taking on many of the powers from the UK government, recognising that in terms of transactions, we'll undertake more transactions as a Scottish government in a week than we currently do in a whole year. But even how we've chosen to locate that new social security agency is important, locating it in Dundee with another office in Glasgow, and it'll have local presence across the country as well. So sharing the administrative function of government across the country is important, as is paying out the support that people should rightly receive. And we want to do much more of that going forward, and that's why we have an ambitious Fairer Scotland action plan, which will report on a whole host of actions, and a focus on a child poverty bill and the new socio-economic duty that we will report on. Actual investment in infrastructure, business development too, and as well as the announcement on the Scottish National Investment Bank to stimulate and support that investment, which is a model supporting many European countries. So it is about the environment we create, the culture that we create for people, for communities, and safeguarding our future as well. So that's the context, hopefully, that we start this discussion in Scotland. We want to hear more from our experts, so please, first of all, give a very warm welcome to Per Bolund, who is, as I say, the Minister for Financial Markets and Consumer Affairs and the Deputy Minister for Finance in Sweden, elected to the Swedish Parliament in 2006, as I say, a member of the Green Party, part of the government, and very focused on inclusive growth. Please give Per a very warm welcome.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you for arranging this fantastic seminar. It's not just because I'm a former student of Sturgeon University, it feels like coming home, coming into Scotland, but hearing the fantastic speech, especially the First Minister, it really feels like a homecoming. So it's good to be among friends. I would say that the world actually has a tremendous opportunity, and we can see that we've gone through a very large transition during the past decades. The past 40 years, we've seen globalization, free trade, and technical development improving the living conditions of millions and millions of households and families as a whole over the planet. And we can see that the planet has actually become increasingly equitable. But at the same time, large parts of the population, working class families in many countries, in advanced economies, have not had the same experience. Furthermore, gains from globalization for societies today have come at the expense of future generations. So if we want our children and grandchildren to inherit inclusive and sustainable society, we have to find new paths going forward. And I think that we have already built the foundations. We have the Paris Agreement on climate, we have the Global Agreement on Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, that provide us with the map and the platform going forward. What we now have to do is to start walking the talk, showing that it's also possible to move into action. We can now also see that critics of globalization in many countries often link the increased inequalities and unemployment rates to the increased globalization and technological development. I and the Swedish government are, however, convinced that if handled correctly, globalization and technological development are opportunities from which the whole society can actually gain. In order for us to do so, I believe that the discussion about progress and prosperity has to be widened and extended to include not only economic indicators, but also social and environmental dimensions of well-being. It is a well-known fact that what gets measured gets managed. And it's obvious to see that today we often measure our progress through economic development, through GDP. And it's, at the same time, it's becoming increasingly obvious that GDP is an inadequate measure of societal development and societal success. The first speaker today quoted John F. Kennedy. I'd like to quote his brother on his views on GDP, saying that GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom or our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And I think that this is a lesson we have to take with us. Greater political focus on social inclusion and environmental sustainability must be part of the solution. In order to broaden the concept and look at well-being from not only being focused on GDP growth, the Swedish government has introduced a framework of 15 different economic and environmental and also social indicators. And we did it in the spring budget this year. And the aim of that is to track well-being and show progress over time. And these indicators will now help guide the government to find economic policies that can bring us into a better future. To create inclusive and sustainable growth, to build trust in our institutions, and to support international cooperation, we must ensure more equitable outcomes, where opportunities and prosperities are shared by the whole population. And research now shows us clearly that equality and good fundamentals for everyone is not just morally right, it is actually also economically smart. By looking at the well-being indicators, this is shown by the fact that many of the indicators are linked to sustained economic outcomes. For example, the level of trust in a society correlates with a high GDP, and with an increasing level of education, we can expect unemployment to drop, and at the same time, people's health status to improve. When building an inclusive society, broad welfare systems have to be strengthened through, for example, broader access to high-quality education, healthcare, and other public goods and services. Our firm belief is also that growth and inclusive growth must be sustainable. Our generation must be able to pass on to the next generation a society in which the major environmental problems have been solved. And Sweden has set high and ambitious targets. We aim to be the first fossil energy-free welfare society on the planet. And we've also started a massive investment program in building the new and sustainable society for the future that we want. So over the past few years, we've doubled the environmental and climate budget for reaching these aims. And we believe that this will be a major driver of our economic future. By making major investments in jobs, in climate action, in healthcare and education, the Swedish government aims to equalize living conditions, to build a sustainable society, and also, at the same time, promote economic development. I very much welcome the increased focus on inclusive growth in the global discussion. I also welcome the focus on inclusive growth by international organizations such as the OECD and the World Bank and IMF that contributes to putting it high on the agenda. Going forward, I'm convinced that we need to learn from each other and to share experiences in these areas. And for that reason, I'm also very much looking forward to the discussions today and to discussing these issues on a broader basis. From the Swedish government, we are convinced that a growth that is inclusive within the population today and between generations is what can actually provide us with the conditions that truly makes our future lives even more worthwhile for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Per, for those thoughts. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Gerry Rice, who's the Director of Communications at the IMF. And this is something of another homecoming for you. You came back when the Scottish Parliament was reconvened to help the Parliament look at its international economic policies and engagement. So a further homecoming for Gerry. So please give him a warm welcome now.
Well, thanks very much, Derek. It's really nice to be home and nice to be back in my alma mater, where I spent 8 years. So, outdoing the First Minister, at least in that respect, probably the only respect. I'd like to thank Derek, I'd like to thank Gary for inviting me here today and putting on this conference, and I would like to commend the First Minister of the Scottish Government and Anton Muscatelli and Glasgow University for convening this conference on such an important issue. It's really hard to say something after the very comprehensive and insightful remarks that have been made by everyone here this morning. So maybe just, since I'm coming from a global institution, try and place just a little bit of context on the discussion today on inclusive growth. We had our annual meetings last week in Washington. We were brought together 189 countries that are the members of the IMF. And I can tell you that inclusive growth was one of the top items on the agenda. So as the First Minister indicated, this is now part of the mainstream debate. But, you know, the context, I think, is three big global transformations that are taking place right now. One is the role of emerging markets and developing countries in the global economy. They are contributing today close to 80% of the increase in global growth. By way of comparison, that's about double to 20 years ago. So that's got major implications for markets, for competition. The second big transformation is the acceleration of globalization, the integration of economies and markets. Now, it's probably at its highest point right now. And just to set in perspective, you know, over the last generation, partly due to globalization, there have been tremendous benefits for many parts of the world. In fact, we've seen the largest reduction in poverty for the most people in human history over the last generation. And that's been in large part due to trade and integration. However, we clearly see that not everyone has benefited. Many peoples and countries have been left out, and we need a different kind of globalization, a more inclusive globalization, I think, is the challenge. So the role of emerging markets, developing countries, the rapid pace of globalization, a need for a different kind of globalization. The third big transformation is the pace of technological change, again, which has been referred to, but I really think this is something very fundamental that we're going to have to deal with going forward. It's about digitalization, of course. It's about artificial intelligence, all of those things that have been mentioned already. Some are calling it the fourth industrial revolution. And this is going to have major implications at the firm level, at the family level, and for the future of work. And I think the big challenge is going to be that in previous periods of history, you know, the need for upgrading of skills and occupations was gradual enough that workers would not need to change occupations during their lifetimes. That's not any longer true, and it's going to be even more so going forward. This means that, boiling it down, I think managing the speed of change and making that inclusive is really going to be the big challenge that we face and key to economic success. Individuals are going to need to be able to adapt more to change, which has big implications for education. And public policy is going to be able to not only do more in cushioning the transitions, but also providing the information and the incentives for skills acquisition. So what will be the attributes of a successful country? Well, of course, there's no simple solution. There's no magic wand here. But I think there are some broad characteristics. One, be open to the world, to take advantage of these new markets and to be able to compete. Two, smart public policy. Derek promised you something about fiscal, and I should say something. The acronym IMF is often taken to mean it's mostly fiscal. It's actually International Monetary Fund, but sometimes it's taken to be mostly fiscal, and we do deal a lot in fiscal policy. As Derek mentioned, last week we published some new research about tax in particular in the realm of fiscal policy, because it lies at the core of increasing competition and reducing inequality. So issues of tax expenditure, tax avoidance, the fairness of tax systems are key, including to provide more financing for social protection. And we actually called for a more progressive approach to taxation. We looked back at tax rates in the advanced economies and noted that in 1981, the average top marginal tax rate in advanced countries was 62%. The average top tax rate was 62%. In 2015, it was 35%. So we had research last week, as I said, that said certainly in some advanced economies you can increase the tax rates without slowing growth. So open to the world, smart public policy, and education. You know, Anton and others are much more expert in this area than I. But it's clearly going to be about investing much more in lifelong learning, and we're going to need some innovative ideas about that. It's going to mean stronger private sector involvement, I think, in the whole area of how education, training, and lifelong learning adapt to these major transformations. In many ways, I think public education in many countries is still geared to the 20th century model. And I think we need education that's much more geared to this fourth industrial revolution. Finally, if I may be presumptuous, is Scotland well placed in the context of these massive transformations? I was coming into this conference today with a view that the answer was yes. And having listened to the First Minister and others this morning, I'm even more convinced that the answer is yes. This is a country that, as you know, has placed a high value on education historically and continues to do so today. We have 5 of the top universities in the world right now, this fine university being one of them. We have a country that has traditionally and today placed a high value on innovation. So today it's in fintech and the environment and the life sciences. And this is where 21st century demand is going to lie. And finally, you know, a bit more personally perhaps, I think Scotland's well placed because this is a country that traditionally has placed a high value on community. You know, I grew up in the East End of Glasgow. My dad was a school Janny. We didn't talk about inclusive growth, but we did talk about family, we talked about friends and neighbours, and we talked about fairness. And I think these are traditional, ongoing Scottish values that will serve Scotland very well going forward in the global economy. And, you know, listening to the First Minister, reading the Scottish Programme of Government, I think there's a very strong balance between the competition that Scotland's going to need, and the ambition that Scotland needs, and the compassion that Scotland needs to make growth more inclusive. So I think Scotland's biggest advantage, perhaps, just to close, is that Scotland continues to be an outward-looking country, open to the world, and I think that's a big advantage going forward. It's open to learning, open to adapting, and I also think, observing the world, Scotland also has a lot to teach the rest of the world in this area, which brings me back to the convening of this conference today, and again I want to commend everyone involved. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much to all our speakers. That convenes our opening session. We've overrun a little bit, so don't worry, there'll be coffees and refreshments outside, and we'll restart at 11:20 so everyone gets a chance to mingle. So I think if we can just finally conclude, what an array of speakers, and I think it all came together really well. So on behalf of the audience, can we thank the speakers? Thank you.